Russian genocide in Ukraine. Should Russia be declared as a war criminal? Now, these are the demands or the demand being made nowadays. The Munich Security Conference, which was held on February 17th, 18th and 19th. On February 18th, the US Vice President Kamila Harris, while addressing the participants of Munich Security Conference, she blamed Russia of severe human rights violations, of killings, injuries, rapes, extrajudicial killings and things like that. And she said forcefully that Russia and those involved in massive human rights violations in Ukraine will be held accountable. Similar views were expressed during that conference, Munich conference, by the foreign minister of Ukraine. And he also lamented that Russia has crossed all limits. Last 1 year has passed since Russia attacked Ukraine. So therefore the question is that if there is an evidence or there are evidences to prove Russia guilty of human rights violations and that was involved in genocide in its occupied areas of Ukraine, will the International Criminal Court take notice of? International Criminal Court has already taken notice of and is investigating allegations against Russia. Now, 30 years ago, that is 1993, 92, 93, Serbian forces had unleashed a reign of terror in Bosnia-Herzegovina, had killed several thousand people, mass graves, killings, rapes, you name it. An international criminal court which was formed later on, it took notice of, and those who were responsible for massive human rights violations were put on trial. Will Russia under Vladimir Putin is prepared for such type of a situation? Because in the Munich Security Conference, a lot of Russia bashing was made. And Russia was not invited in that conference. Was not invited. So therefore Russia was unable to defend its position. The thing is basically that it's not only Russia which is held responsible for genocide in Ukraine. There are other examples also. Various big powers and other countries, aggression, occupation, resulting into genocide, killing, massive killings, injuries. So what is going on in Ukraine is basically a reflection of past acts of genocide. And what is genocide? Genocide is basically when an armed force or armed forces of a particular country, they unleash a reign of terror against local people under their occupation. They want to basically teach them a lesson. So killings, injuries, extrajudicial killings, These are basically done in order to terrorize the local population. So the massacre, mass graves. So that is what is basically going on in Ukraine. Because Russia is very bitter and Russia is angry with Ukraine. That how come during 10th century it was Ukraine and Kiev, its capital now, that the very Russian state was born. That Russia was born in Ukraine 1000 years ago. And the same country now is fighting a war with Russia. And Ukraine has its nexus with Western powers, is interested in joining NATO. So the encirclement of Russia. And Ukraine was the breadbasket of former Soviet Union. So the Russo-Ukrainian war has led to food crisis, has led to energy crisis, has destabilized the world order. So it is yet to be seen how the International Criminal Court will take notice of the allegations of human rights violations, of genocide by the Russian forces in their occupied areas in Ukraine. Because it is the strategy of the West, the US particularly, and NATO member countries, to discredit Russia, to isolate Russia, to blame Russia, that Russia is held responsible for genocide in Ukraine. And that will basically demoralize the Russian people, will weaken the position of President Vladimir Putin, because the more and more pressure over Russia by the International Criminal Court, and if there is a trial of Russian generals and others under whose command human rights violations were committed, that will basically result into the outbreak of another crisis. So that is something which we have to understand, that Ukraine is a test case for Russia. Still time for the Russian President Vladimir Putin to withdraw Russian forces from Ukraine. The West wants, and the Ukrainian leaders also want, that Russia should pay compensation to Ukraine, that $50-60 billion of losses in 1 year's time. Thousands of people have died in Ukraine. And that reparations should be imposed on Russia as a punishment of its genocide against the people of Ukraine.